This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is The Price is Wrong, Why Capitalism Won't Save the Planet by Brett Christophers. What if our understanding of capitalism and climate is backwards? What if the problem is not that transitioning to renewables is too expensive, but that saving the planet is not sufficiently profitable? While prices of solar and wind power have tumbled, the golden era of renewables has yet to materialize. The return on green investment is still too low. We cannot expect markets to solve the climate crisis while the profits involved remain unappetizing. There is an alternative to providing surrogate green profits through subsidies. Take energy out of the private sector's hands. This is Brett Christophers' case in The Price is Wrong, a book as politically far-reaching as it is factually illuminating, a book that Thea Riofrancos calls, quote, a masterful work of political economy that zeroes in on a major obstacle to addressing the climate crisis in the context of capitalism. The Price is Wrong by Brett Christophers, out now from Verso Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the 5th episode of Thawra, The Dig's new series on 20th century Arab politics with historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti. Thawra is Arabic for revolution. It's a word that contains historical multitudes, diverse political radicalisms and revolts that have swept across Arab lands over the past century. Thus far, each episode of our series has taken a region-wide view, zooming into national or local history, but keeping this broader frame within view as we chronicled the consolidation of European imperialism, the coalescence of a mass politics which would oppose it, the tragedy of the Nakba and its reverberations across the Middle East, and the ascent of spirited Arab nationalism organized around the figure of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. But in order to grasp the next chapter in Arab political history and thought, we need to tell a more nationally specific story today. The whirlwind of Syrian history from the 1940s through the mid-1950s. Post-colonial Syria is an unmatched incubator for the new Arab ideological parties that would lead the Mashriq's rebellion against Western imperialism and Zionism, namely the Ba'ath and Communist parties. Syria was a fulcrum for the radical politics of the second half of the 20th century. And its battle lines would shape all those who would aspire to carry the torch of a liberated Middle East. What's more, Syria is the object of a complex regional battle tied to a larger global Cold War, pitting a Western imperialist camp, increasingly led by the United States, against a socialist bloc led by the USSR. This global contest would ultimately develop its own local idiom, a battle between republican and monarchical futures for the Mashriq. The West wanted Syria to remain anti-Soviet. The Hashemite monarchies in Iraq and Jordan, respectively, wanted to merge their countries with Syria, extending the lands under their respective crowns. In particular, British-aligned Iraq's pursuit of Syria and the connivance of various pro-Hashemite forces within Syria in this project are key to this story. I want to lay out a few important figures and forces and some critical issues and moments here. And you might want to rewind this whole introduction and give it a second listen, since this episode is a bit of a wild ride. To start, Syrians revolted and pushed the French out after a post-World War II effort to violently reimpose colonial rule. French colonial troops were evacuated in 1946. The first generation of nationalist leaders were patrician elites who briefly governed the country through the National and People's Parties. Syrian history then takes some very big turns in 1949. It's a year when 3 distinct coups in one year, overturned the political order. The first coup was led by an officer named Hosni al-Zaim after the prior regime was discredited by the Zionist victory in Palestine. The Nakba, as we've discussed, created a legitimation crisis for the entire region's status quo. But this first coup, al-Zaim's coup, was supported and in part orchestrated by the CIA, the U.S. intelligence agency's first overseas covert action. The U.S. wanted a government that would facilitate a major pipeline project to bring oil from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean, and it wanted a government that would be friendly to Israel and hostile to the Soviet Union. This set in place a calamitous pattern that would shape the future of Syria and also the region as a whole. Anyhow, the contradictions of al-Zaim's rule were unsustainable, and his hold on power could not last for long. Just before Hosni al-Zaim was overthrown, he handed a man named Antoun Saada over to the Lebanese government, which executed him. Saada was a very important and rather unusual political figure who founded the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, a highly disciplined, anti-sectarian, staunchly anti-colonial nationalist force that borrowed ideas from the left as well as the extreme right. Al-Zaim's betrayal of Saada led Saada's followers to overthrow al-Zaim. This is the second coup of 1949. It was officially led by Sami al-Hanawi, but with participation from his fellow SSNP allied officer, Adib Shishakli. Formally, Hanawi restored civilian control over the government, which, though dominated by traditional interests, for the first time included at the cabinet level left forces like Akram al-Harani of the Arab Socialist Party and Michel Aflaq of the Ba'ath Party, two parties that would soon merge. At the same time, though, al-Hanawi used his influence in the brief second coup period to pursue union with Hashemite Iraq, something a lot of Syrians opposed because they wanted Syria to remain a republic and because the British maintained so much control over Iraq. So that then led to Hanawi's overthrow by Adib al-Shishakli in the third coup of 1949. Promising an end to factionalism, Shishakli gradually shut down political life, effectively becoming a military dictator. His overreach ended up turning virtually everyone against him, and by shutting down civilian political life, Shishakli incentivized ideological parties such as the Ba'ath, Communists, and the Syrian Social Nationalists to organize factional power within the army. Because this long series of coups that the CIA kicks off helps make the army the ultimate source of political power in Syria. This politicization of the army would prove to be decisive for the rest of Syrian and regional history. Shishakli would be overthrown in 1954. This is the complex history we navigate before discussing at some length these new ideological parties, particularly the Ba'ath and the Communists, but also the Muslim Brotherhood. I want to say a few words about these political parties. Once again, consider this introduction a reference to help guide you through this complex episode. First, we should underline that in 1952, the Ba'ath merged with the Arab Socialist Party, led by a person we will mention again and again, Akram Harani. Harani had ties to the Syrian Social Nationalists and was involved in the second coup government. But the thing you really need to remember is that Harani led peasant struggles against feudal power around Hama in central Syria. When Harani merged his Arab Socialist Party with the Ba'ath, he brought a significant peasant base with him, whereas the Ba'ath was in significant part made up of students, teachers, and new professionals. The result of the merger was a far more powerful Ba'ath party. Second, the Communists, led by Khalid Bakdash, are also critical to this story. Syrian communists begin to accumulate significant power, despite the reputational harm caused by both their allegiance to the wartime and fundamentally colonial Popular Front and by the Soviet support for partition. We discussed how this played out for communists across the region at the end of the last episode. There was cooperation between the communists and the Ba'ath in the mid-1950s as the left united to fight imperialists and imperialism's regional allies, something we'll discuss extensively in the next episode. But a deep divide between the Ba'ath and the communists would ultimately prove disastrous for Syria and for the whole region over the long haul. In the next episode, we'll zoom out to the geopolitics of the Cold War battle that raged for control of the region and that exploded with particular ferocity in Egypt as Nasser emerged triumphant over the British, French, and Israelis during the Suez Crisis. It's a conflict that, alongside other factors like the Ba'ath feud with the communists, that in 1958 pushed Syria and Egypt to join together as the short-lived United Arab Republic. You may be saying to yourself, wow, this is nuts, even for the dig. And then also saying to yourself, wow, I cannot stop listening. I love this. If you depend on the dig for this sort of extraordinarily in-depth historical analysis, the sort of analysis you cannot find anywhere else, please know that it's listeners like you who make this podcast possible by contributing at patreon.com/thedig. We have books, tote bags, and mugs to send you in the mail, depending on how much you donate and where you live. And regardless of where you live, listeners who contribute any amount at all get our excellent newsletter, written by Ben Mabee, delivered straight to your email inbox. If you depend upon this political education project that is unpaywalled so that everyone can listen, contribute now. That's patreon.com/thedig. Thanks. And here's Abdel Razzaq Takriti, Abid for short, who teaches history at Rice University, a scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements. He's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that will be back online soon. We need to shift to Syria for a lot of reasons, including because post-independence politics there led to a very consequential, if rather short-lived, union with Egypt in 1958, which we'll get to in a couple episodes, I think. But let's start out by spelling out how the French, that of course is the European mandatory power that, as we discussed earlier, in 1920 seized control from the Hashemite king Faisal, who had this very short-lived Arab kingdom of Syria. Let's spell out how the French ultimately ended their colonial rule in the 1940s. How did Syria become fully independent of the French in 1946? And how and why did the French attempt to hold on to power in the way that they did, only pulling out their military forces completely after a 1945 revolt, and I believe also under pressure from both the British and Americans?
Let's just start with the fact that the French were never popular in Syria, and they were never able to gain legitimacy in Syria. As soon as they had arrived on the scene, they started by suppressing the original government in Syria, which was established right after the Great War. This was the government of Faisal, who was announced as the king of Syria and who had aspirations to be the king of the entirety of Greater Syria, and of course had been recognized as such by delegates from Palestine, from Jordan, and from Lebanon as well. So we had the Faisali experiment in Syria. It was suppressed. The French armies under General Gouraud invaded. They actually defeated the forces of Faisal in the Battle of Maysalun, which becomes a very symbolic point throughout Syrian history. Everybody will reference that battle as a desperate attempt to save Syria from falling under this vicious colonial rule. So the French came by force. They tried to encourage a politics of minorities in Syria and to encourage basically the creation of decentralization there. They tried to encourage the Alawite population to have their own political scene. They tried to encourage the Druze population to also be split from the broader political fabric. They, of course, had sponsored and orchestrated the separation of Lebanon from Syria. And there they were focusing again on using minorities. They did that separation by basing the whole project around the Maronite Christian minority there. So the French were promoting a policy that was against centralization. It was against creating effective central government. It was against creating a unifying national project in this territory. They were definitely against the bigger Arab project, a project of Arab nationalism that would have included areas beyond Syria, like Iraq and the Hijaz and other places, and definitely Palestine. But they were also even trying to undermine the creation of a unified national sense within Syria itself. And that had major repercussions for the future, because how they engaged in military recruitment, for example, they tried to favor minority mobilization within the army. How they tried to create divisions within the national movement along sectarian lines or regional lines. All of that is well documented. Okay, and it led to fissures. Now, this meant that they had basically placed all their bets on creating a division and sowing the seeds of division. Nevertheless, their policy didn't always work. I mean, the first great revolt in Syria, the biggest revolt that happened during the mandate, was between 1925 and 1927, and that was led, we spoke about it before, but its heartland was actually the Druze region. Jabal al-Druze or Jabal al-Arab, as it was referred to otherwise. I mean, these are all different terms, but basically it was led by Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, who was a major Druze traditional leader, by the way, and from the old Ottoman elites. But this showed their failure of their policy in some ways. You had also revolts led in the Alawite region in Syria, along the Mediterranean coast. You also had revolts emerging in Aleppo. So throughout their period, they were challenged. They were also challenged by the nationalist elites that did not take out the course of revolt and nevertheless worked through what would have been called colonial legal mechanisms, tried to contest the colonial authorities through using their own system. So you had a very complex political scene developing in Syria, but very few people actually genuinely wanted France to stay. The anti-colonial feeling was widespread. The French received a major blow in the Second World War because they suddenly now are an occupied nation themselves. And here there's a struggle over the French colonies between the forces of the government that was set up in France by Germany. The Vichy government is, of course, a collaborator government, but it has to aspire to govern all the territories that were controlled by France. And you have, of course, the forces that are allied with the Free French led by de Gaulle. And these are, of course, close to Britain and the Allies. So you have an internal fissure within France. Its own military capacity is, as an occupied nation, of course, is severely reduced. Therefore, Britain gains ascendancy. And here, the British start believing that if they do not create a long-term useful formula for Syria for them that will allow for a government that is sympathetic to their interests, then that could be very bad for their wartime performance. It could lead to unnecessary tumults, and they therefore exerted enormous pressure on the French in this period to take a stance towards independence, essentially. Now, the question becomes, what sort of independence? Because you have several projects being proposed for Syria at this stage. You have Emir Abdullah, who later becomes King Abdullah of Jordan. We spoke about him before in the series. He's making a bid for Syria. His problem is the Syrian nationalist elite does not want him. You have some sectors that are trying to conspire with Al Saud, they're proposing a project for Syria to be led by a Saudi monarchy. And that, of course, it would be the biggest nightmare for King Abdullah, because the Hashemites had been ousted by the Saudis from Hijaz. They're their traditional rivals. You have people that don't want the monarchy at all and want a republic. And that Republican current essentially wins the day when it comes to the final outcome. You have people that want to take a more hardline nationalist stance, people that want an Arabist stance, people that want unity with Iraq, folks that want Syria to take a separate path. There are folks that want focus on reconstituting Greater Syria. All of these visions are being proposed. And each one of these visions is being adopted by the newly emerging political parties of that period. What's less interesting for me, Daniel, a lot of historians, they spend a lot of time on, well, how did the British communicate with the French around this, and how did the French eventually decide? I'm like, you know what, all of this inter-imperialist back and forth, it's fine. It's worth taking a look at. But at the end of the day, what's more interesting for me is actually what were the people on the ground doing, and what were their aspirations. And that's what often gets missed in the Orientalist scholarship and in the scholarship, that I'm not saying we shouldn't study what the British and the French were thinking, but what determines what happens next for Syria is actually what the local forces on the ground were thinking. Essentially, Syria's independence and Lebanon's independence would not have been possible in the fashion it took place, which, by the way, again, is a byproduct of French weakness. Had the French been in full strength, I think they would have tried to hang on for much longer.
Because Syria declares independence after the Free French and British forces overthrow the Vichy-aligned government in Syria. Syria declares independence, and then it takes a few more years for Syria's independence to be recognized by France, and a few more years after that for the French to actually pull out their troops.
Yeah, so 43 is an important date, 46 is an important date. But what I'm trying to say here is that's one phase. And in that phase, by the way, initially, all the Syrian political figures, Daniel, especially the ones that belong to the nationalist elites, were trying to sound very conciliatory with Britain, which is unusual in the region. That's a strange trend. In the rest of the region, most of the nationalist figures are, of course, attacking Britain.
But they see Britain as a counterweight to their mandatory imperial power, colonial power, which is the French.
Exactly. So they're playing that game. And that's why, if you look at the speeches of Shukri al-Qawatli, for example, in this period, and I have them, he becomes like the first independence and most prominent independence president. Of course, he comes from this old Ottoman notable background. He's singing the praises of Britain initially in these speeches. He's trying very hard not to alienate them at this stage. But that does not last long, because what you have is a new political life emerging. And that's a bit that independence brings with it. Syria, after independence, does adopt a constitutional system. It's a constitutional republic. It has elections. It has a parliament. But now you have all these new social forces coming in, organizing themselves into political parties. The difficulty with these political parties is that none of them could agree on what are the boundaries of the nation.
The British pushed the French to pull out of Syria, but they only did that because of intense popular pressure from Syrians. What did that increasing nationalist mobilization on the ground look like, and how did it interact with the inter-imperial rivalry between these European allies, a relatively strong British Empire, relatively, and a relatively weak French one?
Yeah, so Daniel, we can illustrate that when we look at the French attempt to reassert control over Syria. After France had gained its freedom from Nazi rule, it was going very aggressive on reasserting its control over the colonies. And in the case of Lebanon and Syria, we see the French troops landing in Beirut in May 1945, and they're marching against Syria. They're trying to prevent the sort of independence fervor that was developing there, and the movement towards independence that was actually created practically on the ground since 1943. So, in response, there's a broad popular mobilization that is unbelievable across Syria, and students played a big role. You had the various political parties played a big role. There was an effervescence of activity, including revolutionary activity. And there was a lot of violence committed by the French at the time, including against the Syrian parliament. Their response to the Syrian parties and political leaderships that had rejected the reimposition of colonial rule, essentially, was the shelling of the parliament and the attack on all the leaders there. This happened between May 29 and May 31, 1945. What that showed was the colonial power attacking the representatives of the people. That's the symbolism of it. And it was widely rejected. It also resulted in a huge amount of deaths. It was a massacre. They killed over 500 people. So as a result, you had Britain demanding a ceasefire, and you had all sorts of pressure mounting regionally for the French to withdraw, including from the newly formed League of Arab States.
Conflict and disorder in Syria is just not in the British interest, given the Iraqi Petroleum Company beginning to ramp up production on the other side of the border.
They have huge interests in Syria and in maintaining Syrian stability, including, as you've said, in Iraq. But also, this has repercussions for the future of the whole region. If they're trying to prevent reasserted Soviet Union after the war, if they're trying to prevent Syria exiting from the Western orbit, they could no longer maintain control over Syria by force. And this is something that the British realize at this stage, that they still have colonial interests there, but they want to maintain them by other means. And those other means become very clear in the subsequent years, because there's the struggle over Syria emerges precisely with regards to these imperial interests. For the French, they had an imperial interest in maintaining Syria within the Franc region and to control its finances. France had actually debts that were owed to Syria. They didn't want to pay them. The colonial power owed Syria money. They had also monopolies in Syria over its natural resources and over things like tobacco. They had this Regi company relating to tobacco. So they had their own interests. The Americans were planning to do, and that becomes the long-term interest. They were planning to do the TAP line, which would allow them to transfer oil from Saudi Arabia straight to the Mediterranean. The British also need an outlet to the Mediterranean, especially in subsequent years when the fall of Palestine happens. There needs to be a replacement for Haifa in their strategic thinking, and that's why they were discussing the Banyas project in Syria. So all of these imperial interests play out in subsequent years and in the struggle over Syria in subsequent years. But the power of the people makes the empires afraid for their position.
You mentioned currency. Did the French have ambitions to create something like what they did in West and Central Africa with the CFA franc?
Absolutely. That was part of the idea, is to keep the former colonies within the franc region. This was also what the British were doing in relation to their British former possessions in the region, the Sterling area. They had something called the Sterling area. And this is a global trend, as you pointed out, Daniel. Each colonial power trying to retain some vestiges of its control through keeping up a regional alliance around its currency. And, for Britain, this becomes even more important than for France and Syria. I mean, in places like Kuwait becomes very important for the sterling area. Without it, sterling would have collapsed. These are weak currencies after the Second World War. These are countries undergoing reconstruction. Without American intervention, they would have gone into severe economic crises. So the sterling area, the franc area are part of that kind of trend globally.
So we keep returning to this first generation of nationalist leadership. Who made up this established nationalist leadership that led the struggle against the French and then initially governed an independent Syria? This is a generation of leadership that governed first on their own, and then when the nonstop coups kick off in 1949, which we'll get into later, they govern both alongside and against the military and are pushed aside ultimately by the military. But this first generation of nationalist leaders. They're important powers, very important, until later in the story when more radical, more left-wing political forces like the Baathists and the communists push them aside. Who were these parties, forces, and figures?
So look, in the first Syrian Republic, let's think about it this way. You have initially a phase between 46 and 1950, where we still see a strange dynamic going on, where Syria's political future is still in the hands of the old elites. Okay, so Shukri al-Qawatli is a good example. He's the first true independence president, as I mentioned, and he starts his career in the Ottoman period. So, and he comes from, again, a mercantile family. It's a Damascene family, so not from the countryside, not from the margins. It's from the center.
And also not from Aleppo, which is sort of a competing center.
Yes, Aleppo is a competing center, but Aleppo is also very prominent under the Ottomans, the two most important cities. And that I mean for everybody, including Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan. Two most important cities are Aleppo in the north and Damascus in the south. And Aleppo gets a big hit with the division of the Ottoman territories because actually its hinterland included areas that are now today in Turkey. So Aleppo was the major center for cities like Antab, which is now Gaziantep in Turkey. It's the center of what I always call in my courses the kebab triangle. The best kebabs out there come from Aleppo and Antab and these places. They're named after the names of these cities as well. So both in Turkey and Syria, I mean, this region is great for kebab. But seriously, like Aleppo takes a big hit as a result of that. And Damascus takes a hit too. Damascus is the most important center for all sorts of satellite cities. Jerusalem was in its orbit. Nablus was in its orbit. They don't always have to be administered from there, but that it is the economic hub. It is the political major center. It's always been that way. You know, there are good reasons for that. Damascus has a flow of water to it, and it has something called the Ghouta, which is an area that very rich agricultural land that's watered by that river. So you have all the components that allow for a big city to function. So when we think of Syria's political history, in the Ottoman period, it was these cities that dominated. Big patrician families of these cities dominated local politics. That continues under the French, but you start having competing forces develop in the Mandate period, in the late Ottoman period, that will later on play a very big role. You start getting people from the rural notability achieving a greater prominence in political life, like Sultan Pasha al-Atras. Of course, he's a Durzi Sheikh, he's a prince, actually. This is a major house, the Atras family in Druze politics. Incidentally, by the way, two of the greatest singers in the Arabic musical tradition come from that family, Esmahan and Farid al-Atras. And they're both working in this period that we're talking about. They moved to Egypt and they sing and produce films. But you have the rural notables, you have the urban notables. You have now also the new professional classes. You have Christian figures entering into great prominence in political life as well. People like Faris al-Khoury, for example. And these gain access as a result of their professional qualifications. They enter the professions and they become quite prominent at them. So the Syrian political scene is changing, but it's still in this transitional period where the patrician families matter a lot. And they furnish a whole host of figures. So you have families that are dominant in Hama. like the Abdel Razzis. They appear on the scene. You have families that are dominant in Homs, like the Atasis. They furnish a lot of political figures. These are big houses, and they do play a role throughout this period. But things are changing.
There were 3 coups in 1949 alone, and the U.S. government, as we'll discuss in some depth, played a key role in the first one. But the Syrian people also turned against President Shukri al-Quwatli, but for different reasons. Once again, and this is a constant in this series, the Nakba is key. What role did the shock and anger over the defeat in Palestine, what role did that play in souring the Syrian people on the al-Quwatli regime? A defeat that, as we discussed in the last episode when we talked about the Free Officers movement, a defeat that fueled this general legitimation crisis for the Arab status quo everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. I mean, the defeat was debilitating, and it created a huge amount of resentment. The Syrian army did not fight well in the 1948 war for Palestine. It failed to protect Palestine. To be honest with you, any military observer would have predicted that. I mean, forget about the Zionist mythology that it was a small number of heroic Zionists defeating all the Arab states combined. It means very little, because the Arab states combined at the time did not have large professional armies.
They'd just been governed directly under European colonial rule.
Yeah. These were countries that were suffering from European colonialism. Syria suffered a lot under colonialism. I mean, the suppression of the Syrian revolt was just horrific, and we spoke about that before. The debilitation of political life, the economic harm. I mean, I don't think people understand what colonialism means. Sometimes it's painted as, oh, it's this great thing that brings development. Honestly, like it brought a lot of horror. People came out of colonialism very weak. These states came out very weak. Syria certainly came out with a very tiny army. There were like 4,000 troops in the Syrian army at that stage. How are you going to fight a major war when the Haganah could mobilize tens of thousands, along with the other militias? This was the difficulty, and it was not well armed, it was not well trained, and the political will as well was seen as lacking. In the case of Shukri al-Quwatli, it was seen that he didn't do enough. He didn't do quite enough. That was the view. And he wasn't blamed alone. All of the Arab leaderships were blamed, and rightly so at the time. But again, the structural factors should not be forgotten. It wasn't like Quwatli wanted to lose Palestine, but he didn't have much capacity to prevent that from happening, and he didn't do enough with the capacity that he had. So he paid the price. But the CIA was involved also.
Yeah, let's talk about the CIA, because this first of 3 coups, and I'm just going to keep laying that out so people don't get confused. The first of 3 coups, led by this military officer, Husni al-Zaim, the CIA plays a role, and most listeners probably don't know that this was the CIA's first overseas covert operation before Guatemala and Iran. So what role exactly did the CIA play in this first coup against President Shukri al-Quwatli, and why is their role so often missing from historical accounts of CIA coups that, for good reason, focus on Guatemala and Iran, really horrific and historically consequential events? And then lastly, why did the U.S. government decide to help bring al-Zaim to power in the first place? Was it mostly because the government in power had opposed this proposed pipeline to export Aramco oil, the so-called TAP line project?
So there's multiple interests that the Western governments had in relation to Syria. And they're important to understand when we think about the coup and about their interests. One is, you've just mentioned that, there's the question of the TAP line project. And that, of course, is important for the logistics of moving the most important product that the imperial powers need from the Middle East, which is oil. So there is an interest in ensuring that you will have a Syrian government that is committed to maintaining Western interests in the region. Now, you have another interest going on, which has to do with the newly created Israeli state. And that actually becomes the more politicized dimension in this whole operation. Hosni Zaim, military officer who develops and cultivates relationships with the Central Intelligence Agency and other Western agencies at the time. Even the British knew about his machinations, and they were quick to also legitimate his coup. So he carries out this operation with planning from the CIA, not just backing. Now, some people used to contest that in the past. I think the documents now pretty much prove that it was a CIA-led affair. If we want to understand why it was important for the US, let's look at what they were trying to get Zaim to do, because that tells you, if you want to understand why they launched a coup, let's say removal of Allende in Chile. Why did they launch it? Let's see what Pinochet is doing and what agenda they're trying to push here. And the main agenda they were trying to push in the case of Hosni Zaim is reconfiguration of post-Nakba Middle Eastern arrangements. They want Syria to, first of all, undertake a conciliatory line in relation to the Israeli state. But Syria has a set of problems here when it comes to that. It had absorbed a large number of Palestinian refugees. It did not believe that these refugees should be denied the ability to go back home. The majority of the Syrian population, including its organized social and political forces. So none of them wanted to have resettlement of their refugees.
Something that should be familiar to listeners from what's going on right now, and Israel trying to frame moving Palestinian civilians out of Gaza as some sort of humanitarian measure.
You're absolutely right, Daniel. And what's interesting here, I'm glad that you brought up this point, because this actual initiative now, that's being proposed now by the Israelis, goes back to this period. The minute they had expelled the people, even before they had expelled the people of Palestine, they were promoting projects for resettling the people of Palestine. Because the premise of Zionism is a Jewish state with as few Arabs in it as possible. And a Jewish state over the entire area from the river to the sea. Sometimes they contest people using that phrase, river to the sea. Actually, it's the Zionists that use that slogan the most. So in this period, there was this enormous pressure exerted by the United States and other Western governments for the Arab states to resettle the refugees. The refugees themselves did not want to be resettled. Their demand was repatriation, not resettlement. And repatriation is actually a right enshrined in international law for all refugees. And it should be that way. If somebody drove you out of your home, Daniel, whether you're in Palestine or whether you're in Bosnia or Rwanda or Ukraine or anywhere, you'd hope that other people in the world would understand that you need to go back home. Because otherwise, if we say it's okay to drive you out of your home, then it's okay to drive everybody out of their homes. And if we say that your descendants would lose that right, let's say after you've been driven out of your home, then you're also delegitimizing the demands of people to gain back their homes and encouraging the aggressive power to continue in its aggression and to expand it. Because people will just then set a precedent for the lack of return. So that's what the Arab states were worried about. Now, the question of what is to be done between Syria and Israel, therefore, at this stage, or the newly established Israeli state, is something that's big on the horizon. The question of where Syria is going to land eventually in global Cold War alignments, although at this stage is still within the Western camp, but nothing in American planning is disconnected from the Cold War as well at this stage. There are long-term objectives for the whole of the Middle East, ensuring that it will stay nicely within the American orbit.
And the U.S. is unable to read anything in the Middle East, probably anything in the world, except through a myopic Cold War lens. Everything is read through it.
Absolutely. They read it through this lens. And to be honest with you, they had also local figures that were invested in it. We had men on the spot, like James Hugh Keeley Jr., who was a very sketchy American figure involved with CIA, and who was also working with another sketchy figure, Miles Copeland Jr. They saw it and they tried to, frame it in different ways. I mean, Copeland wrote a book actually later on called The Game of Nations. It's a bit of a weird kind of title and a strange book. But there he was suggesting that their main determination was to somehow put a showcase for democracy in Syria. And the worry that the U.S. had was that in the aftermath of the war, if there's state collapse in Syria, which the war had created conditions that enabled that. The government under Qawatli was weak after it. Let's say state collapse happens. Then you could end up with their Cold War logic being plausible. Because what if the Syrian Communist Party takes over? What if other parties that are opposed to the United States take over? Then they could ally with the Soviets, and the U.S. would have a problem. So you have these different logics going on: a Cold War logic, an Israeli legitimation logic, and the protection of long-term Western interest logic operating here. But the end result was the same. What they had done actually is set a very destabilizing precedent in the history of Syria and in the history of the whole region. This is the first major military coup in this part of the world. And as you suggested, it has repercussions for other countries later on. It's a test case of how the CIA can use the coup as a successful tool. And I've written quite a bit on coups, Daniel, and on colonial coups in particular. These are British orchestrated coups, but American ones are neo-colonial. They have slightly different dynamics and objectives. Almost always, they pretend that the country is independent and they insist that they have nothing to do with the coup. And that's exactly what the US did here. They pretended they had nothing to do with it. This is just Syrians doing their own thing. But, strangely enough, the first country to recognize the new post-coup government was the United States. And then we suddenly see Britain and France and all these Western powers and Western allied regional countries like Jordan immediately recognizing the coup.
Another key factor is the constant conflict over how to relate to Hashemite Iraq and Hashemite Jordan, both of which wanted to unify with Syria, a program that in the Iraqi case was known as the Fertile Crescent, and in the Jordanian case as Greater Syria. And any Hashemite union with Syria was staunchly opposed by Egypt and Saudi Arabia and by various factions within Syria. What is it about what colonial rule did to Syria and to the regional order that almost immediately after independence makes Syria's position so contested and unstable?
The first thing to note is the structural dynamic. And I mentioned this, that's why I started this episode with the discussion of structure. The Syrian state did not come out of colonialism with the capacity to have a monopoly on violence fully. It did not have a strong army. It did not have strong bureaucracies. It was underfunded. Secondly, the French had not sponsored a project that would have enabled the creation of a national identity that is unifying in this country. They tried to deepen cleavages within society and the state rather than actually encourage forms of centralization. Thirdly, Syria was a country that lost much of its hinterlands as a result of the division of Arab Ottoman territories. And this is why it's so important to talk about places like Damascus and Aleppo and Homs. All of these cities, and these are the main cities in Syria, had lost zones of trade, commerce. The mercantile and notable classes in these territories were hurt by the separation from Lebanon, from Jordan, from Palestine, and even from parts of southeastern Turkey. So the new regional map had severely undermined them. This is why it was not surprising that you had multiple movements that were dissatisfied with the boundaries of Syria, and for good class reasons as well. If the main function of the Syrian elite in Aleppo and Damascus and Homs was basically trade and small manufacturing that is geared towards their surrounding provinces, then they were hurt by this. They lost their main ports. Damascus would have benefited from its traditional port cities like Beirut and from the newly emerging port cities like Haifa, which would have been so great for Damascus. But it gets cut off from that. Homs gets cut off from Tripoli, which is within its region, and they're so interconnected. Aleppo loses Antakya and the whole of Iskenderun, which were its traditional port for centuries and possibly millennia. These areas had been connected to these regions. So there are structural reasons for why people would have been dissatisfied with the map and why you would have had different visions for reconstituting a better map. And Syria becomes a very big center of pan-Arabism as a result, but also there are other visions that are being proposed as a result. There's a greater Syrian vision that's represented by the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which is actually one of the parties that played a key role in the coup against the coup.
We should emphasize that in this early post-colonial period, we didn't have the republic versus monarchy, regional conflict, Arab Civil War, Arab Cold War that would soon become definitional in the region. But instead, if I read the history right, we instead had a monarchy versus monarchy divide, two monarchical camps, the Egyptian and Saudi monarchies facing off against the Hashemite monarchs in Jordan and Iraq, and Syria kind of being at the center of that conflict. What was the geopolitical, geoeconomic, or maybe more ideological basis to this divide, and why did this divide play such a key role in this pre-Nasser moment in structuring the region?
None of the radical movements ever believed that any of these divides were worthwhile over monarchies, or over which monarchy to ally with. Because if you look at all of these monarchies, almost all of them are under the British, and one of them is under the Americans, the Al Saud, at this stage, and had been previously floating in the British orbit. So which imperial client will you be allied with was really what was being proposed at this stage. And to radical movements, that was dissatisfying. So none of the radical parties ever wanted the monarchical option. They were all Republican in outlook. They did not buy into the monarchies. However, they were still at the stage building their bases and building their ideologies. So at the 1940s, we still have them at their nascent phase, these parties. So the people in power are the old notables. The old notables are still thinking in terms of which monarchy, which imperial client will I be allied with, and all sorts of determinations go into that. If you're Hashim al-Atasi, you want to be closer to Iraq, and you have good connections with the Hashemites there from the old days with Faisal. And, if you're Qawatli, you don't want that, you don't favor that option, and you're looking into other possibilities. And that's the way those political games were played. We have an alternative coming in after the ideological parties appear on the scene.
Al-Zaim, after he took power in that first coup, and just a few weeks before he was overthrown and executed in the second coup of 1949, he made a really consequential decision to hand a man named Antoun Saada, the founder and leader of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which you just mentioned, to hand Saada over to Lebanese authorities, who immediately executed him. And al-Zaim had initially agreed to support Saada and then betrayed him. And Saada is an unusual but very important figure. And to many critics, he led a movement reminiscent of European fascism. In short, if I have this right, he was the founder of a school, a very particular school of greater Syrian nationalism that was based on a sort of land or geographically determined theory of nations and national identity. And this was one that was very idiosyncratic and very opposed to pan-Arab nationalism. What does the story of Saada and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party teach us about this particular moment and more broadly about mid-20th century Syria? Because he and his party are a bit hard for me to understand even after reading up on him, but they seem so important to understand. So many key figures pass through the party, including notably Adib al-Shishakli, the man who leads the last coup of 1949 and then becomes military dictator until he's overthrown in 1954, and also Akram al-Harani, a key figure throughout this period, who we'll get into more later, who very importantly in 1952 merges his Arab Socialist Party with the Ba'ath Party. But anyhow, what is up with Saada and his Syrian Social Nationalist Party? What's up with them, and why are they so consequential in this moment?
Okay, so Saada is an interesting figure because he was actually a prolific writer. He worked in journalism as a young man. He had actually been in Brazil, like many people from Mount Lebanon, in the late Ottoman period and early Mandate period. They immigrated to South America and North America and other parts of the globe. He ended up going to Brazil and ended up working in an Arabic newspaper there. He learned many languages, Daniel. This guy, knew Portuguese, knew Russian, knew German, knew Arabic, French, English. Quite an impressive figure, actually. Well-read in philosophy, but also influenced by the romantic nationalist tradition that was prominent at the time and that came out of Germany, especially in the 19th century. But the boundaries of the nation he promoted were different than those that were advocated by Arab nationalists like Sata al-Husari that we spoke about earlier. So in his view, really it's Syria that is the nation, and Syria meaning the old Bilad al-Sham, but also he adds to them Iraq.
Cyprus?
And Cyprus is what they call the Star of the Crescent. So if you think of the Fertile Crescent, which is Greater Syria plus Iraq, and then Cyprus is the star. And for Saadi, his argument was, this is the birthplace of civilization. These are the settled, fertile areas in the most ancient part of the world. They include all of these great ancient cities and monuments and accumulation of civilizations. And they have features that are specific to them. And they render them different than, let's say, the Arabian Peninsula or even Egypt. He sees them as being part of a civilizational system that is separate. And in this way, what he's doing is basically he's going to the pre-Islamic histories. And to this day, SSNP members will refer to figures from the old Babylonian and Syriac and Assyrian and other traditions. They'll talk about Ishtar and
he's bringing in like Canaanites. It's like
Canaanite thing. Yeah. Because then you don't have to emphasize the Arabness bit. Now later on, of course, the party, by the way, in later years grapples with the question of Arabness and adjusts to it. But definitely during the period of Anton Saade, it was focusing on Syria as being a separate national construct than the rest of the Arab region. On some level, it does make sense in the sense of he's talking really about the territories that were under the Ottomans in the late Ottoman period and were lost and taken over by Britain and France, minus Hijaz.
He's almost a Mashrik nationalist.
Almost, but minus he doesn't want the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. He views it as a zone of nomadic life, and there's almost an Orientalist thing going there a little bit, like definitely.
Where these are backward nomadic people.
Yeah, he definitely sees Syria as superior, but the interesting thing here is that's not his main emphasis, although he does have to talk about it to give justifications for why he doesn't want to include them in his national vision. Because, of course, he's competing with people that are promoting an Arab nationalist vision. And sometimes he comes up with weird formulations that sound like they're influenced by fascist thinking. Like, the Syrian peasant has to be energetic and strong because they're dealing with tougher soil. Egyptian peasant can afford to be lazy because things grow on the Nile. There are these statements that you hear weirdly in SSMP circles that are influenced by such theories of nationalism that would belong more that are influenced by the fascist tradition. But we can't just reduce SSMP to fascism. Sometimes people do that. I think there's more to it. I mean, yes, when you look at the symbolism, people look at the flag of the party, and their symbol is the zawba'a. And sometimes they confuse that with the swastika. It looks somehow similar, but actually that's not what the symbolism comes from. It is in reference to the Greater Syria symbol. But there are influences, undoubtedly. I mean, this is, after all, a party that does emerge in the 1930s. The place of the leader in the party is especially important. Saadi was presenting himself as essentially a father of an emerging nation through his leadership of this party, through being literally what he called a za'im, a great leader. So when you go to a party, even today, any SSMP event, they will chant La za'ima illa za'im, and they will do a move similar to the fascist salute in that. Now, doesn't mean that they were subscribing to European fascism. That's where I warn people about that. But they're adopting some of the kind of organizational methods.
So, what's Saada's role under al-Zaim, including up until his demise, thanks to al-Zaim? And then, what's the role of Saada's demise in al-Zaim's own demise in the second coup of 1949, which was led by Sami al-Hanawi less than half a year after the first coup? And the second coup is interesting in part because it brings left-wing forces into the new cabinet, including socialist al-Harani and Ba'ath Party founder, someone we've discussed extensively in a prior episode, Ba'ath Party founder Michel Aflaq.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's think about Saadi for a second first, and let's look at the positive element about his party, and that will help us understand the story. We spoke about some of the sketchier bits, these fascist regalia and organizational features. But in reality, and the most important aspect of this party is that it was staunchly anti-colonial and that it was staunchly anti-sectarian. And there is something about the culture of the SSMP to this day, even though now it's a very small movement, much smaller than it was before. You will notice that in social relations, these people are very anti-sectarian. They don't do Christian, Muslim, Jewish, anything like that. Okay, what matters to them is the nation. That's why you will find that they will marry across religions. They will not discriminate on the basis of even regional basis. They try to erase religious difference as well as class difference. And here, this is the bit where they conflict also with their radical visions, because for them, class is an obstacle to unifying the nation. In the initial iterations under Saadi, he was saying we have to prioritize the nation, not the class at this stage. But we'll provide the nation with some welfare and so on. So there's no emphasis on class struggle. It's a national struggle. However, that national struggle for him is predominantly an anti-colonial struggle. So this is the bit that is the positive in Saadi and in the SSMP. They were very strongly anti-colonial. They tried to overthrow French rule, They tried to act against forces in Lebanon and Syria that they saw as working with the French. And basically, Saadi paid the price for that. Saadi paid the price for that because he was wanted by the Lebanese authorities. And he was imprisoned earlier by the French authorities. And in fact, he had even been exiled. That's when he spent time in Argentina, and he had a lifelong commitment to combating colonialism, essentially. When it comes to figures like Hosni Zaim, they're opportunists. This guy is installed by the CIA. This guy is willing to do anything for power. Honestly, you just have to take a look at a picture of Hosni Zaim. I don't like to judge people by their looks, but he was trying to project an image of almost a mafioso boss. Like it looks like, there's no ideology there. There's no program there.
Yeah, just look at the Wikipedia photo for Hosni al-Zaim.
Like it's out of The Godfather or something.
It is so mafioso.
Yeah, and that's how he operated. The guy he'd do anything for power. I mean, he was very craven, And, some people have tried to rehabilitate them in recent years, weirdly enough. You always find these attempts by historians to rehabilitate and some people in biographies. I'm like, no, there's very little to admire in Hosni Zaim. I'm sorry. I will take that issue with anybody that tries to say this guy was had anything good to do or say. However, one of his acts that really proved to be disastrous for him was one of these mafioso acts, which is essentially he handed over Saadi to the people that wanted to kill Saadi, and essentially the Lebanese government had struck a deal with him. So this was a really, really bad act on the part of Hosni Zaim. What he did not know was that there are people that had been recruited by Saadi in Syrian political life. And they had roles to play in Syrian army life, particularly Adib al-Shishakli. And they were not going to just see a situation where Hosni Zaim essentially entraps Saadi. Saadi had traveled to Damascus to meet with him. His party had tried to launch a revolution in Lebanon, and the Lebanese authorities had wanted him for that. They wanted his head for that. They had been clashing with the party for a while. So he announced a revolution in 49. He went to meet with Zaim. Zaim comes in and tells him, yes, come over, and gives him all sorts of promises, only for Saadi to find that he gets handed over. The military court then immediately essentially sentences him to death. And SSNP members will not forget that. They don't forget it even today. So Adib al-Shishakli launches a coup against him, and Zaim falls as a result.
The second coup of 1949, it's officially led by Sami al-Hanawi, but it's really led by Adib Shishakli, who goes on to more officially lead the third coup of 1949 and then became a dictator until he's overthrown in 1954. How did the ongoing conflict over the question of union with Hashemite Iraq end up consuming and then undermining the Hanawi government, leading to that third coup of 1949, the second led by Shishakli, though I believe he also had significant involvement in the first one?
Right. So Sami Hanawi and Adib Shishakli share a similar party background. They both have SSNP connections, Syrian Social Nationalist Party connections. They were both seeking to avenge the assassination, or what they considered to be handing over Anton Saadi, the betrayal of Anton Saadi on the part of Hosni Zaim. And they organized this movement along with some of their comrades, and they carried out the coup against Zaim. They killed him, and they killed also his Prime Minister Barazi. Later on, of course, a cycle of vengeance operates, and Sami Hanawi gets assassinated by Barazi's relative. So We see this situation developing. Now, Sami Hannawi, despite his similar ideological background to Adib Shishakli, he is very committed to this idea of a union with Iraq. He becomes increasingly interested in that. He establishes connections with the Iraqi government at the time. Now, this was very problematic for a lot of established political forces and figures in Syria at the time. Certainly, the more radical forces rejected this idea, including even some Arab nationalists that had centered Arab unity in their discourses and approaches. You might wonder why. Why would an Arab nationalist oppose unity between Syria and Iraq at this stage? And the answer is very simple. It has to do with Iraq operating within the imperial orbit. Syria exits the orbit, the formal imperial orbit, as in the rule of treaties, the direct official control, as a result of the particular circumstances during which it gained independence from France. It gained independence from a weak France. Whereas Iraq, Jordan, Egypt were still tied to Britain, as we've talked about. We've talked about this in previous episodes. So for Syria to go into union with a state that's still tied to Britain with a treaty, that has a British aligned government, that has effectively an army that is very much dependent on Britain, would have placed Syria in the British orbit. And the feeling that hard-won independence was going to be compromised by this was very strong. The other dimension was the Republican dimension. These political movements in Syria and personages, many of them, especially on the radical wing, had rejected monarchism. They did not want to see monarchical dominance in their affairs. Syria actually had a functioning party life and a parliamentary system, and they wanted to continue that. To his credit, Sami al-Hannawi did not dissolve the idea of parliament. He did not attack the idea of parliament. He actually respected the notion of having a civilian government. You know, he never became president after his coup. So he stayed out of these official positions. And even the government that was formed as a result of the coup that he had led, and of course, as you mentioned, Shishakli had played a key role in that coup. Without him, it probably would not have succeeded. But in the case of Hannawi's involvement in politics, he kept a distance between the army and the government. It was clear that the army is a major player and could overthrow a government, but nevertheless, they kept their distance at this stage, and there was a civilian government. Very important things happened during that short period of that civilian government. And I want to emphasize one of them that is essential for us. In this period, we have important discussions about how Syria will address the women's question. And women's suffrage gets granted in Syria, and it's the first country in the whole region that engages in that. And that's a result of a very active women's movement that had demanded that from the mandate period onwards. But also it's a result of the development of progressive political parties and movements. And some of the figures that pushed the hardest for this suffrage to be granted were people that had broader progressive agendas. Like somebody like Akram Hourani, who was represented in the ministry during the time of this second coup era, was particularly pushing for this law. Of course, you had the pressure from the street, from the women's organizations, but then in the government, you had people like him. They were saying that essentially you cannot have, in the age of the nuclear age and the age of discovery and so on, a situation where women were still not voting. This becomes a big source of social conflict, actually, in Syria for a while, because all the conservative forces that were anti-women mobilized, but eventually they failed. And for me, that's a barometer of the state of the country, because it shows that there is a strong progressive movement there that was able to carry out major steps towards one of the most important questions confronting any society, which is that of women's liberation.
There's this really significant historic achievement for the women's movement in Syria, but that's not the only achievement that these more progressive secular forces are making in Syrian politics at the time. While in Lebanon, you have this system, this highly sectarian electoral system being put in place. In Syria, those sorts of sectarian structures in the electoral, in the political system that are formally in place are getting pushed back upon at the time.
Right. So you have this progressive push to cancel sectarian electoral laws, which would identify districts on the basis of and seats on the basis of sect. And again, the progressive members of the Syrian cabinet at the time were pushing towards that, towards canceling that, because the Syrian cabinet that emerged in the second coup was actually represented multiple social forces. It included ones that were very traditional. It included strong representation on the part of big capital through the Aleppan group around the People's Party and the Atasis of Homs and other figures of that sort. However, you did have also more radical elements that were pushing for change. They also were pushing for canceling the stipulations on the religion of the state as well. So there was a secularization push that we were seeing, and it achieved variable results, but at least it was a big part of the push at the time. Another thing that was very significant was the incorporation of Palestinians and Palestinian refugees, giving them equality for all government jobs in Syria. And that, again, starts with the progressive figures in the government, like Akram Hourani specifically, because he was the Minister of Agriculture. And he actually insisted that he needs Palestinian agricultural experts and engineers to be appointed to ministry jobs.
This is, again, another thing that's in contrast to how things are playing out in Lebanon, for example.
Absolutely. So what you end up with in Syria is this becomes the first step towards granting Palestinians equality in the workplace and in government jobs, and later on in military jobs, by the way. Until even recently, some of the senior most ranking figures in the Syrian military were Palestinian. Essentially, however, the only difference between a Syrian and Palestinian is that they would still recognize that the person is not a Syrian citizen. They're a Palestinian citizen because they don't want them to lose their political right to return, but they give them equality in employment and in jobs. And that was very much a push from the progressive forces in the Syrian government at the time.
The final 1949 coup came in December, led by, again, Adib al-Shishakli, who would gradually consolidate power as a full military dictator until he was overthrown in 1954. What was Shishakli's motive in launching that final 1949 coup? How does his role in that coup differ from his role in the prior coup? And then how, over half a decade, did he concentrate power in the way that he did? So gradually and slowly. Was it a multi-year plan, or was he adapting in the ways he saw best to the chaotic, conflictual trajectory of national politics?
I mean, again, this is where different competing interests and visions for Syria go into play. So, okay, we got rid of the CIA-backed Zaim figure. Then we have a situation with Sami al-Hannawi. Now, Sami al-Hannawi was an interesting figure. He did actually restore parliamentary life to Syria after the initial coup, to be clear. However, he was also had dealings with the Hashemites. And there was growing Hashemite interference in Syria in this period. There was another bid done by Hashemites to kind of court Syria into some form of situation where they would control it. And in that situation, you were bound to get anti-Hashemite forces to react. So the reason why Syria is so, again, vulnerable at this stage is that the boundaries of the nation have not been set, and there is no national consensus internally on these boundaries or on who's going to govern and what system is going to govern. So the Hashemites are putting in this bid. There is a counter bid that happens, and there are counter forces that operate here. One of them was Shishakli. Shishakli was very popular in the army. He had the ability to make a move, so he did. It's all connected to these structural forces. We can you read sometimes these books, some of the good books on the subject. They dive deep into, well, this person was allied with this and that person was allied with that. You lose the plot. You lose the fact that really, it's about the lack of a national consensus over a vision for the place. And different competing class dynamics too. And the class dynamics come in when you examine, you can see them so clearly when you examine a figure like Akram Hourani, who you've referenced over and over again. Because, for example, for Akram Hourani, the main priority was to break the power of the old semi-feudal rulers of the country. His initial background was in anti-feudal struggles in Hama, which is his city. He came from a family that had a relatively prominent history, but that had been downgraded economically and in the class structure. His father, they did not grow up rich; he grew up poor. But and those kind of characters, they sometimes play an interesting role in class struggle. But he was in a town, Hama, where two families essentially owned half of the villages around it. The Azams, who were very strong in Damascus, were strong feudal family in Hama, and Barazis were another family in Hama. By the way, if you tell Azam or Barazi you're feudal, they'll complain, no, we were not feudal. And I know this because I've had conversations like that with some of them. And it's like, no, but the honest truth is, when the peasants, for example, launched a revolt in 1933 in Hama, demanding better conditions because they were working for these families and they were exploited by them and they were taxed by them. I mean, it was honestly, they were so dominant in that countryside that they tried to organize. And Hourani, actually, one of the main memories that impacted him was the memory of that revolt. He says that in his memoirs, because the way they crushed it, they brought in this cavalry and they went and attacked these peasants that were just trying to improve slightly their working condition. The violence that was witnessed, there were killings, there were torture, there was all sorts of horrible stuff going on. So it was really ruled by terror in the countryside by some of these big land-owning families that, sometimes you read about them in these books and they focus on how wonderful they are and fancy and look at the nice clothes. And we should never forget that there's class struggle behind all of this, Daniel, as well. So a figure like Akram Hourani comes in and gets elected into the parliament on an anti-feudal agenda.
Yeah. In 1951, he leads a violent peasant uprising against those landlords around Hama.
Correct. So we have another recreation of the same dynamic. So you have local social class struggles going on. You have also a regional geopolitical map that is deeply unstable, and where you have different competing interests, both within the Western camp. There are fissures, and then there are new competing forces that are seeking to get Syria out of the Western camp in this stage. And that eventually does happen, by the way. Syria does not stay in the Western camp forever.
So what should we make of the trajectory that Shishakli's period takes toward military dictatorship? Because he initially stays away from assuming total power, and I don't know if that's because he doesn't want it or because he's strategically not yet ready to seize it. He's initially a close ally of the socialist Hourani, and he purges a lot of the traditional political elite, which is beneficial to the left, but he ends up repressing or attempting to repress pretty much every political force in Syria, including the left. He adopts a sort of police state approach to governing, gets a reputation as a sort of Ataturk-like modernizer, tries to repress and manage minority ethnic and religious groups and impose sort of Arabism and Muslim dominance, all of which helps bring about a 1954 coup against him, which draws on just the animosity of all of the various enemies that he's made by 1954. But what do we make of this trajectory?
So it's a very complicated trajectory because Shishakli, on the one hand, we should understand that he's very keen to maintain good relations with the United States and with Britain, which means that he wants to stay on good terms with the West. At the same time, he has bad relations with some of the West's satellites in the region and its clients, namely Iraq, and partly, to some extent, Jordan, although he calms down after the assassination of King Abdullah, because King Abdullah was more ambitious than his son Talal, who briefly rules. And then, after Talal gets removed and the British oust him on the basis of mental health conditions. But some people believe that was a coup. King Hussein then became the king of Jordan. That all happens in the same period, but both Talal and Hussein are not a threat, are no longer exhibiting Jordanian designs on Syria. So the main problem is with Iraq, as far as Shishakli is concerned.
And specifically with Abdel Razzaq, who's at this point, the regent of Iraq, because his nephew, King Faisal II, is still under 18.
Correct. So Shishakli has then a problem with Iraq and with Abdel Razzaq, as you mentioned, and really with Noor Saeed, who is the real figurehead in Iraq, running the show there. He's the shrewd politician behind the scenes, really. And he's Britain's man there as well. He has a initially hostile attitude to Nasser and the free officers as well. So it's not the best relationship. So it's complicated. He's within the Western camp, does not have a good relationship with the Western allies. He's against the formation of the Israeli settler colonial state, and he's actually adopts a very strong policy on that, despite the fact that he wants to court the West. Nevertheless, he cannot see eye to eye with the other force that's opposing this settler colonial state in the region strongly, which is the free officers in Egypt. So, and that means that he's collecting a lot of local enemies. The radicals don't see him as radical. He doesn't have a social program of radical reform. He tries to centralize power in the army, and that gains him some enmities. He embarks on a project of state centralization that leads him to clash with some of the minority communities that had established powers in the country, especially the Druze. And eventually he pays the price for this, Daniel, because he actually gets assassinated by a Durzi figure in Brazil.
He orchestrates massive repression in Jabal al-Druze, this really important Druze region in southern Syria.
There was an insurgency in the Jabal al-Druze region that he represses heavily.
They're massacres.
There are definitely massacres going on there. What Shishakli's admirers will tell you is that he protected the unity of the country through cracking down on a separatist attempt. Others will have a different interpretation. They'll tell you that this was a heavy-handed response on the part of the central state. Let's just say that it never got to a stage where it's a full-blown civil war or massive insurgents. It was really a tension between the Shishakli government and the Durzi leaderships at the time. It does lead to heavy-handed state repression that does cause a major political crisis for him.
And just to reprise briefly, why this trajectory? Why does he move from this position of basically saying that the military needs veto power over certain things, and particularly has the right to nominate the Minister of Defense, to directly governing as military dictator?
The difficulty here, Daniel, has to do with how you conceive of your position in the state. Initially, if the military is your base of support, which it was for him earlier, you'd want to promote the position of the military. Later on, when you gain power, as Shishakli here, and you start seeing yourself as playing some role in unifying the nation, start seeing yourself as being the guarantor of the nation not going in a direction that you see as negative, whether it's pro-Hashemite alignment, or whether it's pro-free officer alignment, whether it's a communist direction, which is why he had a major, Shishakli had major beef with the Communist Party. He did not want class struggle in this country. He did not. That was also his problem with the Ba'ath Party as well. He saw them as too radical. They saw him as not radical at all. And as a result, they played a big role in his demise. But if you start seeing that, what you want to do is to try to centralize power.
And then he saw established nationalists like the People's Party as attempting to sell out Syria to Iraq.
Correct. And again, what we notice here now is with the end of the mandates, and that's a structural pattern. Not many people think about it this way, but I do. With the end of the mandates, those sort of local nationalisms, the sort that was associated with the People's Party and other parties of that sort, decline. You either have a bigger vision like Pan-Arabism, or you come up with another bigger vision that's based on religion, like the Muslim Brotherhood, or another bigger vision that's based on class and communism, basically like the Communist Party. The local visions are not functioning very effectively now as radical visions. They're no longer seen as that. They're seen as the conservative visions that need to be countered.
Yeah, so on that point, what is going on with civilian politics as this parade of coups transitions into Shishakli's dictatorship with various nationalists, including the longstanding nationalist parties like the National Party and the People's Party, and then these more ideological parties, the communists, the Baathists, the Muslim Brotherhood, all building and vying for power. And in and out of power, increasingly, these more radical parties pushing for a neutralist Syria free from imperial rule and in great power entanglements in general. I guess more specifically, what's the strength of these newer ideological parties like the Ba'ath, Communists, Muslim Brotherhood, compared not only to these traditional parties, but to these traditional centers of social economic power that had for so long been fundamental in Syria?
Yeah, so the difficulty with disentangling the story, Daniel, is to understand where the regional intersects with the ideological and also local politics as well. So looking at it regionally within Syria, as we mentioned, there's two big centers of power. There's Aleppo and then there's Damascus. They produce different movements. And then you have also cities like Hama and cities like Homs. They produce their own movements. And this is not counting, by the way, other regions from Deir ez-Zor to the Alawites regions. They all produce their own dynamics and politics. Yet there's also a national trend. Take the People's Party, which plays a big role in some of the stories that we're referring to. That's led by figures that are primarily associated with Aleppo. Okay, it's not, doesn't summarize the party, but mainly its main strength was in the Aleppo region. And its main leaderships tend to come from there. We're talking about people like Nazim al-Qudsi. We're talking about Mustafa Barmada, for example, Rajdi al-Kikhi. All of these big figures in People's Party life, they come from Aleppo. Aleppo has special ties to Iraq, historically. And again, this is my own interpretation. Some historians might take issue with it, but like historically, I view this in class terms, and I look at it in how the class intersects with the geographical. Aleppo's historic links with Iraq are so strong that, it and Mosul have been two sister cities from Ottoman times and even before. You come and establish this artificial map. That's not good for their trading interests, for their big capital, for the bankers and the merchants there. And those guys are the main supporters of the establishment of this party, but also of its agenda or principal agenda in the late 40s, early 50s, which is to enact a union with Iraq. So that's the story there. You have other parties that have other stories. We alluded to Akram Hourani and his own movement, which later coalesces into the Ba'ath. It comes out of an anti-feudal struggle in the Hama region, which has a social structure centered around this big land ownership. So you have this situation, Daniel, where we really need to look at the intersection between class and region and the broader geopolitical map, but also the local struggles over the direction of the country in general. And all of this is taking place in a Cold War environment where the question of alignment really is always on the table. Now, you have ideological parties taking clear stances when it comes to the question of alignment. The old traditional parties generally were in the Western camp, or tended to favor closer relations with them, although some of their figures later break with that tradition. Nevertheless, the struggle for Syria at this stage has to do both with local players, primarily Iraq and Egypt. Earlier, Jordan and Saudi Arabia were involved big time in it. And of course, with the global players, which are United States and Soviet Union primarily, but also with Britain playing a supporting role in all of these episodes. And then you have hostile regional pressures from states in which Syria has either outright state of war with, like the state of Israel, which is the newly established settler colonial state, and states in which there's an up and down conflict with, primarily Turkey. So it's a very complicated map. And it's a map that is born out of Syria's position, but also the way it was governed under colonial rule. It would have required an enormous unification project to resolve all the contradictions within Syria at the time. The regional, the sectarian, the class, and the geopolitical. I'm not surprised at the instability that had taken place in Syria during that period. And we should not be surprised. It's a country rich in its diversity, and it had, as a result of careful colonial machinations, had not yet found a formula for going forward in a unified manner, and that was going to affect it for many decades. Later on, some of these dynamics resurface, including in the Arab Spring. There is a countryside-urban contradiction. There are multiple sectarian contradictions. There is a class contradiction, which for me is really the number one problem internally. Although others minimize it or ignore it completely, but there are enough historians that do care about that dimension, Daniel, and I'm sure listeners of the Dig would appreciate the importance of that dimension. And then you have all these vultures roaming around. Literally, I mean, Soviet Union, United States conflict causes all the Western powers to try to really enforce their rule over this region. They want to make sure that it doesn't fall into the Soviets, and they're acting in very parasitical ways towards Syria.
I'm Astra Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, a podcast that helps us understand the past so we can organize for a better future. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Care, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Pramila Nadasan. In this eye-opening reckoning with the care economy, scholar Pramila Nadasan traces its logic and history, showing that it's an institutionalized, hierarchical system in which some people's pain translates into other people's profit. As Sarah Jaffe puts it, in clear and concise prose, Nadasan takes apart the care industrial complex that has emerged, like the military and prison industrial complexes before it, to wring the last drops of profit from the lives and deaths of working people. an absolutely necessary intervention in the most important political debate of our times. Find Care, the highest stage of capitalism, at haymarketbooks.org, where readers in the US and UK receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £20, respectively. As part of my preparations for this episode, as you know, I've been reading the late, great British journalist Patrick Seal, who was this close observer of Syrian politics for decades and this sort of pro-Arab Arabist who was somewhat Orientalist but also revolutionary, who wrote a ton about Syria in the 1940s and 50s and is just sort of this kind of character that doesn't exist anymore. But in his book, The Battle for Syria, he has this analysis of this period that kind of reminds me of Marx's 18th Brumaire. He writes, quote, "One of the dominant themes of the next few years was the contest for power between the army and the divided politicians who, seeking friendships in the army to use against their civilian rivals, only speeded their own surrender of day-to-day decision-making to the ever more ambitious and domineering officers." My question is, to what degree did this period of military coups put a dynamic in place that would decisively shape Syrian politics, not only over the next decade or two, but really over the long haul? What in other words, is the concrete legacy of Shishakli's dictatorship and all the coups that paved the way to it?
So I mean, honestly, Daniel, and I know that our listeners will not be surprised by this, the big problem starts with a U.S. decision, which is the U.S. decision to carry out the Zaim coup. That starts the precedent of the army intervening in civilian affairs and in the government. And once you start with that precedent, it's very difficult to turn back. Zaim also starts introducing some features of the cult of personality and other different dynamics that are associated with these kind of military dictatorship style moves. However, these things happen in stages. You still have political parties, you still have a very active political life, you still have a parliament. And initially, as we've mentioned, in the coup against Zaim that was led by Sami al-Hanawi, initially there's a respect of these structures and their independence. Then in December 1949, Shishakli carries out a coup against Hanawi. People refer to it as the Colonels' Movement, Harakat al-Uqada in Arabic. And essentially, that was over a geopolitical question, which is alignment with Iraq, and over, as I mentioned, the Republican question, which is, will Syria continue to be a republic? But then you end up having a very interesting and tense relationship between the army officers that carried out that coup and the civilian government in place during that period. So we start with a demand by the army that they have a representative of theirs in the Ministry of Defense. And that's a guy that's known as Fawzi Sillu. He becomes actually a president later on for a short period. He is put there to ensure that there wouldn't be Hashemite influence, and we end up in a drama around that in a struggle essentially between the civilian government and the army over this appointment. Many of the parties that were progressive rejected the appointment as a point of principle. The Ba'ath Party, for example, mentioned that it's objecting to this. The Arab Socialist Party, which later unites with the Ba'ath Party, actually, as a result of the dictatorship of Shishakli, they end up also taking a strong position against this. But the way Shishakli deals with this is through actually essentially cracking down on the civilian government, including on the non-progressive elements and the traditional leaderships. So he becomes very suspicious of the People's Party representing Aleppo. He is already very suspicious of the main party representing the Damascus elites, the patriotic party, Hizb al-Watani. And, he is alienated now, the Ba'ath and the Arab Socialist Party. he's already alienated the communists because of the fact that he wants alignment with the West and declares it. His only beef with the West is over Israel. Shishakli, by the way, was a staunch supporter of the Palestinian cause in theory, and he did not want to succumb to American pressures to sign treaties with the Israeli state. But nevertheless, he has all sorts of problems with progressive forces, including the communists and others. So we end up with a situation where this is somebody who does not trust political parties and has a crisis with them. And they're at the same time realizing that now that the military is playing such a big role in politics, their only hope is to start intervening in the military and establishing cells in it. Especially after Shishakli dissolved all political parties and started banning newspapers and started taking over party headquarters, started banishing party leaders. He reaches a point of no return with them. And that becomes very problematic for him. He puts them in a corner, and he also creates conditions for his own downfall by putting them in the corner.
He also creates these conditions for the sort of political factionalization of the military, because political parties, political actors who would otherwise be acting in a democratic system through political parties are forced to create bases of power within the military, essentially.
That's exactly what's happening. You're so right on this. Even though, by the way, some of these political parties did not have deep-seated differences with Shishakli over many issues. For example, they might agree with him on alignment or in rejecting alignment with Iraq. A lot of the progressive parties did not want a union with Iraq. But they had problems with him over his relations with the Saudis, his proximity to the West, and additionally, the question of democracy and the question of feudalism and the peasantry. This was a period where a lot of progressive forces were noting that there's this expansion of agriculture in Syria, especially around the cotton industry. Cotton becomes booming in the 50s in Syria as a result of the Korean War. It drives the prices of cotton up globally, and that leads to Syrian capitalist class and all these to invest actually in agrarian projects. Cotton being the foremost amongst them, but they also need to acquire state lands as a result, and they start concentrating land ownership, especially in the Jazeera region. So all of these issues are worth taking into account when we are talking about the question of Shishakli's contradiction with political parties. For the medium and long-term legacy of this, we can see this in Akram Hourani's commentary, for example, in his memoirs, on why they started creating military formations for the Baathists in the army. And he said and I believe him in his memoirs. He says that military coups were not our pathway to rule, and we did not think of that at the time at all. And we believed that the democratic parliamentary route was the only way forward. This matter was very clear to us, despite of all the claims of colonialists and reactionaries. And he said, had our party or had I wanted to get to rule through the army, we could have done that, especially because we had a strong base in the army. The fact that they did not pursue that path, and here I'm quoting again, they were committed to the democratic path, that, quote, opened the door for adventurers to jump on authority, ranging from Hosni Zaim to Hannawi to Adib Shishakli. So for him, he sees that for the longest time, the established progressive parties did not actually want to establish a military pathway. However, they end up being forced, according at least to their original leaders like Hourani and others, they found themselves forced into that direction because the army itself becomes a hub for politicization.
We keep returning to this issue of how ideological parties were ascendant at the time of the 1954 overthrow of Shishakli. And I want to get into some more depth on that, starting, unsurprisingly, with the Ba'ath Party. In 1952, as you've referenced, the Ba'ath Party merged with the Arab Socialist Party, led by Akram Hourani, making the Arab Ba'ath Party, the Party of Arab Resurrection, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, or the Socialist Party of Arab Resurrection. What sort of socialism was Hourani's? What sort of base had he developed in the rural areas around the city of Hama? And how did this merger shape Baathism and what Baathism meant by Arab socialism? Because I think Hourani, as we've been discussing, has been deeply involved in politics for years, including the 1949 coups, to organizing what I think we could describe as peasant insurgencies in the countryside in central Syria.
Yeah, so Daniel, what we find here is that the Ba'ath itself, before its merger with Hourani, had a wing that was committed theoretically to socialism, but it also had some important central figures that were not. And that becomes a source of tension within the leadership. So you had Jalal al-Sayyid, essentially, who comes from the Deir ez-Zor region as a result of his class background. That's a region where you do have large land ownership developing. And for class reasons, as well as ideological reasons, he does not believe in class struggle or the idea of socialism per se. He's on the right wing of the Ba'ath. But you have figures like Salah ad-Din Bitar and Michel Aflaq, the two original founders, that do believe in socialism. However, of course, not the radical variant that could be interpreted as a communist one.
And we talked quite a bit about how Michel Aflaq, especially because of the 1930s, in the 1930s during the Popular Front period, the French Communist Party acquiescing to mandate rule as part of the Popular Front against fascism. That was, amongst other things, quite an alienating experience for them.
Yeah, and the failure of the local communist, Syrian Lebanese Communist Party at the time, because they were united, to actually confront the French Communist Party and French colonial authorities, that alienated him. I mean, there was a chance, I believe, for Aflaq and Bitar. They were fellow travelers. I mean, they could have actually conceivably been drawn into communism had there been different kind of policy on the part of these parties. We don't know. Again, it's a counterfactual, but they're not staunchly anti-socialist. However, what they do have is a greater emphasis on the nation than on class at this stage. Hourani's trajectory is slightly different because he comes from a less of a theoretical background and more of a practical one. This is somebody who grew up in a very difficult economic situation. You know, it's pretty much a single mother raising him. That, by the way, influenced his views on the women's movement as well, because his mother was a very important presence in his life and worked really hard. He has very extensive passages on how her experiences influenced his own worldviews around the vote in Syria. But in the case of Hourani, he is dealing with a localized semi-feudal situation prevailing in his own town. Hama had the most extreme version of land concentration and a dominant family, patrician family presence in there. So you had the Azim family. We talked about this before. The Azim family and the Barazi family really used to terrorize the peasantry there. They owned entire villages and they forced people into submission and they suppressed revolts and they were armed, heavily armed. They had gangs attacking people. They had cavalry. Any peasant movement demanding any improvement in people's lives would be crushed by them. And these people also used to dominate politics and parliamentary representation. So he always ran as a local candidate in Hama. He had managed to go to law school and graduate from there. And as a local party candidate from Hama, he always had to fight against the feudalists. And the base he needed to mobilize were basically peasants who were undermined by these major landowners and that sought to overthrow their monopoly on land, on capital, and on the control of politics. So he came out of a real situation of class struggle in that way. And that's important. Now, how developed is his view of socialism? I'm not going to tell you that it is that you find in the Ba'ath, the stage, even after the unification of the two parties, clear articulations of what a socialist future will look like fully. However, they do have clear positions in relation to monopolies. So Syria was confronting a situation where there were a few companies that had established monopolies over key sectors in Syria, the Shirk al-Khumasiyya, other companies of that sort. These had acquired enormous power in the Syrian economy. They had been granted enormous powers during the time of the rule of these military rulers, but also some during previous governments that both under the mandate and later on in the early years of independence had represented dominant classes. For example, the Syrian government had given them extensive loans in the early 50s, had given various industrialists very extensive loans, and sometimes they were not paying back, sometimes they were, it depended. There was all sorts of clear evidence of the state being used by the capitalist class for developing its own position. And the same class was the one that was driving towards union with Iraq, for example, at this stage. Because as we mentioned earlier, the Aleppan merchants in particular had an interest in that. It would have opened up new gateways for them. And there were very clear benefits that they could have derived.
This was the Aleppan merchants' traditional commercial hinterland, was much of Iraq.
Absolutely, but also think of it this way. Iraq has the petroleum, and it has all the enormous agricultural resources and other resources of that sort. And then you have on the Syrian side, the transit trade, the location on the Mediterranean, and you have this, as a result, a very strong mercantile-minded class. But also, in the case of Aleppo, it's an old industrial base, actually. And even in the late Ottoman period, it was more advanced than other cities in that regard, both in terms of mercantile activity and in terms of manufacturing. It has that interest. So Iraq would have served it. So for the parties, we have to always remember what is the base of each party. The union of the Ba'ath and the Arab Socialist Party represents the merger of two social bases. In the case of the Ba'ath and Michel Aflaq and Salah ad-Din Bitar, their main hardcore support was amongst teachers and students. And this is very interesting. It starts out of a youth movement. And their base, it's quite astonishing how many teachers were involved in the Ba'ath Party at the time, if you look at it. And you have people belonging to the new professional classes, come from lower middle class / middle class backgrounds, some working class kids that had accessed education and therefore had a clear pathway towards social ascendancy into the middle classes. So that's the base of the Ba'ath Party under Aflaq and Bitar. You look at the Arab Socialist Party, the people that are getting Akram Hourani elected are mainly peasant local districts in the Hama region. So it's both regionalized. He has a strong base in his own region. It has a clear class address, which is that of the peasantry. So that's his base. And we see a merger of the two bases with the merger of the parties. So despite the fact that you had a wing of the Ba'ath being opposed to the greater emphasis on the redistribution of property that Akram Hourani's wing had, and I mentioned Jalal Sayyid being a good example because he comes from that social base of land ownership. However, you still find that the overall political atmosphere encouraged the merger. They had a very similar geopolitical reading. they also could agree on most local political and social issues.
We should really now thoroughly introduce the Syrian Communist Party, which was founded in 1925 as the Communist Party of Syria and Lebanon, in part thanks to the organizing work of Joseph Berger, a leader of the Palestine Communist Party, who was a Jew from Poland, who came to Palestine as a Zionist settler and then became a communist. How did the Syrian Communist Party and its Kurdish leader Khaled Bakdash, how did they become such a force in 1950s Syria? And particularly, how did they pull off that popularity, given what we discussed earlier in this series, which is how Soviet support for the partition of Palestine and the Czech arms shipments, how that all undermined communist credibility everywhere in the Arab world. I mean, and we already discussed how Baathism essentially emerges as a reaction to communist acquiescence to the mandate as part of the anti-fascist Popular Front, well before Stalin supports the partition of Palestine. This is long-running reputational challenges that the communists face, and yet still.
So, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this question. It's very complicated because it goes through various phases. But when you look at Khaled Bakdash's career, really, and he becomes a dominant figure in the Syrian Communist Party, it can tell us a lot about what's going on in these dynamics that we're talking about. I mean, Khaled Bakdash, joins the party early on when he was a young student in the university in Damascus, he comes from the student movement. Like you mentioned, he's joining a party that's joint Syrian and Lebanese at this stage. It's the only party that crosses national lines within the communist movement. And we talked about this earlier, about the problems with that, the lack of transnational organizing. He goes quickly up the ranks. After spending some time in the University of the Toilers of the Orient or of the East in Moscow, he really establishes a very strong set of relationships with the Soviet leadership. And he really becomes an enforcer of the Stalinist line within the Syrian Lebanese Communist Party. He's an interesting figure, very, has a knack for survival. He always knew when to leave before an arrest would come. Whenever there was a problem in the party, he would somehow conveniently leave the country. So he had this instinct for staying in power within the party. So, from 1936 till his death in 1995, he was a Secretary General. You don't achieve that without being very good at internal, machinations and conspiracies within the party, but also without actually really loving some form of power, and he really clung into party leadership and power. He has his fans, but definitely there he has his detractors within the communist movement in the region. Now, Khaled Bakdash's historical trajectory included periods of struggle. For example, the Communist Party was very committed to fighting against Vichy, and the Vichy French forces. They organized very strongly during the Second World War, and they played a big role in promoting anti-Nazi sentiment in the Arab region. That's something we should never forget. The communists took a lead role in that. They introduced anti-fascist language in the region in much more radical ways and trusted ways by the people than those issued by pro-Allied governments in the region. Because during the Second World War, there was an active effort on the part of the fascist governments of Europe and the Nazi government to try to recruit all colonized people across the world, not just in the Arab region. And, in the case of the Arab region, they were subjected to a media campaign that was trying to encourage that. And they had these radios. The most effective use of the radio, the first really effective use of the radio in the region was through the Italian fascist radio that was established and then later on Radio Berlin. So you have a movement countering that, and that's the communist movement. They really put a lot of work into that, and that's important.
We should underline that the reason there's this opening for fascism in the Arab Middle East is that the anti-fascist allies, the British and the French, are also, of course, the colonial rulers of the Arab Mashriq. So that creates this opening for European fascist powers during World War II. In 1941 in Iraq in particular, there's an Axis-aligned coup against the British and the Hashemite monarchy, and the coup was put down ultimately with British armed force. And it generated a lot of sympathy. The coup generated a lot of sympathy from many Arabs, not necessarily because of anything having to do with fascism, but instead because it was a blow to British colonial power.
You're onto something very important, Daniel. In this case, in Iraq, and I especially want to emphasize that when you look at the ideology, in this case of this coup, which is often referred to as the Rashid Ali Jilani movement, that movement was not driven by fascism per se. There is no Arab fascist party that's established, for example, in this that has broad mainstream allegiance.
Its relationship to European fascism was opportunistic.
First of all, in the case of this particular coup, the relationship is is hotly debated. Many of the local historians do not actually view this as primarily an Axis-inspired movement. They see it as one that was led to prevent Britain reimposing control over Iraqi territory. So there are complicated readings over the Rashid Ali Jilani movement. Of course, the Communist Party of Iraq rejected it, and other progressive movements had their own beef with it. But if we want to look at it, take a step back and view it as historians, we really have to look at what is the Rashid Ali Jilani movement. They're rejecting Britain, saying we want to use Iraq for military bases without restriction. That was the British demand. And the Iraqis are saying, well, we're still under a terrible treaty with you, but we had recently, just a few years back, arrived at a treaty that gave us some sense of independence, even if it's minimal. The core part of that treaty is that you don't get to use Iraqi territory in whichever way you want. So that's actually how this thing starts. Now, of course, there are other ideological dimensions to this. The leaders of this movement saw a possibility for gaining independence in the context of this war, but we don't have evidence that this was, as the British had claimed. The British always claimed that this is Axis-inspired. It's not exactly the way it worked out. There were eventual intersections that happened, but they were the primary driver of such movements was actually local circumstances and clashes with colonialism locally. So the other interesting thing about the Syrian Communist Party, Daniel, and the Syrian Lebanese Communist Party, I should note, is that it, along with other communist parties in the region, modernizes party life in the region. Without it, you would not have had the party formula as we know it today in the region, or as we knew it in the age of the great ideological parties. The communists really start introducing methods of how to organize, how to start an effective party newspaper, how to establish party cells. There's a lot of know-how that goes into this. And of course, we had different earlier models of party life in the region, but the communist one becomes very significant. Now, that comes with positives and negatives. Communist parties bring in a formula that's much more effective in managing opposition and in managing popular mobilization. A downside is there's also Stalinist influences in the style of the party. That structure that's very much inspired by the idea of central leadership having a very strong role and determination in the way party operates. There was often a crisis of party democracy. And we saw this actually, especially in the case of the Syrian Lebanese Party, when you had the partition resolution. I know we keep going back to that, but in the case of the partition resolution, Khalid Bektash actually goes and humiliates comrades and forces them to retract. He disgraces some of them. He forces them to change their positions, and that becomes a crisis. Also, his positions attract attacks on the headquarters of the party. There was a major armed attack on the headquarters of the Communist Party during that period. Now, despite all of these downsides that we mentioned in relation to Bektash and the party that he led, it's very important to note that they had a progressive position, relatively speaking, on most issues, social issues in this period. So again, their position on women, communists are the first to really engage women in a serious political formation. Of course, recent studies have done critiques of that, and there are limitations to the involvement, but there's definitely a great deal of involvement that's going on relative to the general atmosphere. You have, transnational connections that do develop as well. Bektash develops relationships with Fahd, who heads the Iraqi Communist Party. He has relationships with the different Palestinian leaderships in the party. He has an extensive web of relations that do matter and that allow for some coordination on a regional level. The communists at the phase of the Shishakli period and its aftermath, they had opposed the Shishakli dictatorship in a major way. And they were victims of it as well, because you had this crackdown. They had been actually victimized since the Hosni Zaim coup. Zaim, as we mentioned earlier, was very allied to the Americans. I mean, the first thing that this guy does is, sign the tap line agreement without passing it by parliament, imprisoning communists, declaring that Syria will fight communism. After his government falls, and the new leadership that's installed by Shishakli and his comrades does not actually release all communists from imprisonment. They release everybody else, but they insist that the communists need to stay in jail. So they continue on the Zaim track. So there's strong tension between Bektash and the Shishakli regime, and of course between the Communist Party as a whole and the Shishakli regime. Now, Bektash wins a seat in the elections of 1954, and he's able to restore some of the representation of the party after this period in which the party had been prevented essentially from operating in mainstream political institutions. And it's clear that he's also cultivating a base in the army like everybody else is doing. So that becomes part of this drama of party competition, inter-party competition within the army. And he contributes to that. He has to, in many ways. He's not the only figure doing that.
One aside, and I don't want to take too long on this, but I think it's interesting. Does the Jewish role in the Communist Party of Palestine, and thus informing the communist parties of Syria and Lebanon, does that point to some possible counterfactual, non-colonial possibility for Jewish presence in Palestine that colonialism kind of made impossible?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think what's more interesting to ask is how did communist parties view the minority question in general, and what is the role of minorities in them? I mean, including Jews. So, for example, the Iraqi Communist Party had a lot of Jews in it, but these are local Iraqi Jews. Unlike the Jews in Palestine that founded the Communist Party, who were primarily from Eastern Europe.
From the Pale of Settlement.
They were from the Pale of Settlement. They came under Soviet pressure to Arabize their membership. This is what matters here, and this is the bit that's interesting. In order for them to gain approval by the Comintern, the Soviets told them, so wait a second, you're in a country where 90% of the population does not belong to your ethnicity. You just recently arrived there, and you want to register this party as a Palestine Communist Party? How is this possible?
Go find some Palestinians.
Go find some Palestinians. And And of course, they were under also Soviet pressure to not engage in nationalist deviation, and one might add from a Palestinian perspective, in colonialist deviation in this case, because they wanted to be also heard within the Zionist movement. And that was a problem because the Zionist movement was very clear on expelling anybody that rejected the Zionist line. They did not want people who rejected colonialism. They wanted their own version of socialists and communists. People like Polizion, which basically was never really a socialist organization, even though it claimed to be. They always promoted socialism as an aspect of Zionism, not the other way, and did not prioritize class struggle at the end of the day. Even Zionist historians admit to that. Years ago, Ze'ev Sternheld proved that in his book, and despite the fact that he's a liberal Zionist historian. So it's very important for us to understand that fact. Now, it's also important for us to not overemphasize the importance of these Jewish communist figures in reaching out to people outside. Communist parties would have developed in Iraq and Syria and in Egypt regardless. And that's an important point to note, because sometimes people who are anti-communist try to claim that this is some colonist conspiracy.
And even worse, a Jewish colonist conspiracy.
Yes, but I mean, for example, nobody has a problem with Iraqi Jews having played a big role in the Iraqi Communist Party. I mean, I've never heard anybody in any progressive circle in the region have an issue with that, because these were seen as Arab Jews, are part of the region. Anything that has to do with colonists in Palestine gives things a different flavor and sheds it in a different light. It doesn't mean that none of the colonists in Palestine had any progressive streaks, but there were always problems with the course of the Jewish communists in Palestine, because they were always split between. They had this kind of situation where, on the one hand, they felt that their own grounding within the Jewish community in Palestine, which was primarily Zionist at this stage, because it was brought by Zionists from Eastern Europe. Okay, it's not the communists that lead the colonization, and in fact, they had taken an anti-colonization line. But at the same time, they're living in communities and they're trying to organize in communities that are colonist communities. So how do you deal with that? And then, in the meantime, they want to also organize with Arab Palestinian communities. That then leads to a combustive situation where the party explodes, essentially. They have an internal split. Because of the Arab communists come and say, well, you guys aren't internationalists enough. But you're not standing with the main anti-colonial revolt happening in this territory. I mean, it's during the 36 revolt that really this explodes. I mean, it had origins before that, but they're like, how can you not take enough of a strong stance? And later on, this drama develops and gets worse and worse, until we hit the Nakba. So there are all sorts of problems within the communist movement on that front. However, your question is important, because what it allows us to also recognize is that there were so many active Arab Jews, Egyptian Jews, Iraqi Jews that played pioneering roles in the progressive movement in the Arab world in that period, and they played lead roles in communist parties, along with other minorities. Khalid Bakdash, for example, belonged to the Kurdish minority in Syria, and there were many other different figures that were associated with such communities, either ethnic or religious minorities that were active in these movements. I don't want to overemphasize that. Some people overemphasize it, again, to delegitimize these movements, ignoring the fact that actually they had a broad-based coalition precisely because they foregrounded class and foregrounded internationalism.
The divide between the Ba'ath and the communists was deep and very consequential for Syrian and Iraqi history, and thus also for the region as a whole. And it's not for no reason that they had these differences. As we've discussed, there was a substantive divide in terms of how the Ba'ath and communists viewed things, and the communists had serious problems because of the way they were essentially dominated by the Soviet Union on really critical questions. But still, it seems like the two forces did agree on so much, and that it shouldn't have been inconceivable to unite around a pretty substantial minimum program. And yet, that never happened, even though Baktash, the communist leader, repeatedly called for a national unity front.
I mean, eventually it does happen, by the way, I should note, Daniel, but under not in a real way. It's under Ba'athist rule, and it becomes a front. In Syria, for example, today.
Yeah, there's a communist minister, quote unquote communist minister in the Assad regime right now.
Yeah, and they have these formulas, but it's not a real cooperation in a real way. And actually, that cooperation actually results in a split within the communist movement later on in Syria. Their decision to not do opposition against the Assad Ba'ath becomes a cause of tension with Khalid Baktash and splits. But going back into the actual question that you asked, I think it's a very significant question. If we look at the geopolitical map at this stage, they all do not want the region to continue to be under Western control. Okay, so they all are committed to exiting from that. The communists share the Ba'athist suspicion also of British plots for Syria. That's why they had opposed Hashemite union plans with Jordan earlier. That's why they never liked the Saudi plans and of Saudi cooperation between Shishakli, forces like Shishakli and Saudi Arabia. That's why they were suspicious of the Egyptians as well, particularly the monarchist Egyptian government before the Free Officers coup. Later on, after the Free Officers, it's a different story. It becomes more complicated, the story. But what we're dealing with, therefore, is a similar reading of the regional map in that way. However, there are differences in principle that do matter. The main principle that animates the Ba'ath is the idea of Arab unity. Arab unity is the essential and core belief of most Ba'ath party cadres and leaderships. They do take nationalism seriously. They see nationalism as an essential component of political life, and they have a different reading of nationalism than the communists. They see Arab nationalism as an anti-colonial variant that is not a xenophobic variant of the sort communists accuse them of having. So that's the official position of the Ba'ath founders, at least, and original leaderships in this period. Now, of course, you have people with xenophobic views in the Ba'ath leadership too. Jalal al-Sayyid, the guy I mentioned, for example, had notoriously anti-Kurdish views, and we can go into that later on and go into the details. But in the case of the overall leadership of the Ba'ath at this stage, they insisted that they were nationalists, but of the anti-colonial variant, and that they saw nationalism as a vehicle for a colonized region to regain its independence, its sovereignty, and to establish healthy developmental programs, and that's their outlook. In the case of the communists, they would have seen this as a nationalist deviation, this emphasis on the nation. They have a problem with it. They did not trust enough in the claims of their competitors with regards to socialism. And they often, actually, they were publicly, on the Ba'ath side, they were especially critical of Hurani, for example, because they saw him as a competitor locally. You know, he's appealing to the same class they're trying to organize. If his claim is he wants to organize the peasantry and the working class, then he's a natural competitor. And they'd rather have those sectors joining what they would see as a movement that was more mature, that had a clearer ideology. I mean, that's always been, by the way, the communist position. They're like, what is Ba'ath ideology? It's not, we have Karl Marx and Lenin, and, they would have added Stalin, of course, and all of these figures. And who do you guys have, like, in terms of your theorists? And they were always accusing the Ba'ath of not having the solidity and the tradition of organizing and the global breadth that they had. An even more important factor is that the Ba'ath was actually into non-alignment for real, whereas the communists were not into non-alignment. The communists, of course, wanted Soviet alignment. And you can't be a member of any CP in the world at this stage and not have that as your main aspiration. And if you go through the history of the communist movement, I mentioned this in previous episodes, they really had such a high view of the Soviet Union. They held it in such high esteem. They viewed it as a major vehicle for liberation. So their views differed from the nationalist parties that had adopted some socialist language like the Ba'ath at this stage, and even sometimes policies. So they considered that these parties were being silly when they were talking of non-alignment. How can you not align with the state that represents the future of humanity? So those are key differences.
And we will return again and again to how consequential and really just bloody, tragic, horrific this divide ends up being for the region.
Yeah, and you do end up with also personality clashes, Daniel. You end up with competitions over power that further this divide. And sometimes what happens is the fact that the region is so interconnected plays a role in this divide. So in the case of Baghdad, for example, he takes a strongly and staunchly anti-Nasserist line, for example, in Syria. And throughout the 50s, he becomes the main vehicle for opposing that. Well, I know we'll talk about it later, but that puts him at odds with other parties that did not actually view the free officers in the same way. Now, part of the reason why he takes this line against Nasser is when Nasser represses the Egyptian communists. That's important for Baghdad. He needs to take an anti-Nasserist line. Also, when the Soviet Union is critical of Nasser in certain key junctures, he obviously will need to clash with him in certain in those junctures. So there's multiple regional factors and international factors that play into this, and then they reflect themselves on the ground in serious ways. Additionally, changes in Iraq affect Syria, and we can talk about that later. I know we will.
In terms of these ideological parties, I think we should talk about Islamists, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. Where are they at this moment, around 1954? And in particular, how does their political program and mass base differ from those of the other ideological parties that we've been discussing?
I mean, Daniel, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood at this stage is interesting because it has a slightly different trajectory than other Muslim Brotherhoods at this particular moment. Its leader, Sibai, actually advocates a strange philosophy, not a strange philosophy, but one that is different than the mainstream one adopted by other Muslim brothers. He's at this stage advocating Islamic socialism. And that becomes really interesting. We have the Syrian variant developing its own trajectories at this stage because of its leadership. However, it has fundamentally different visions of society than, of course, the other parties. By default and by definition, you cannot look at Muslim Brotherhood ideology as a secular one to begin with. Whereas you can say that the dominant set of ideologies that prevailed at the time were secular. Even the conservative rulers that had been aligned with the British and the French had secular tendencies at this stage. Definitely the progressive parties were staunchly secular at this stage. And we spoke a little bit about this when we talked about their fight to cancel the sectarian electoral laws in Syria. And obviously they had a stronger stance on issues such as women's liberation and so on. So on social conservatism questions, the Muslim Brotherhood saw itself as a movement that had to preserve that. I should note, again, the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood at this stage, later on, becomes, it takes on different ideological trajectory. But at this stage, it is less, how can I say, staunchly conservative than, let's say, the Egyptian one. But, that doesn't continue for long. I mean, it depends a lot on leadership. And under Sibai, it takes a more liberalized line, but it's still, compared to other parties, it's definitely on the conservative end of the spectrum when it comes to social questions. So, and in the view of the Muslim Brothers, the current age and its ills come as a result of the distance of people from Islam, from Islamic values, from collective values in Islam as well, like mutual cooperation, like having healthy communal life by going to the mosque and participating in social institutions. In many ways, their thinking came as a response to, and this is something that a lot of scholars argue nowadays, that there are responses to these missionary pushes that appear in the early colonial period and that continue. And by the 1920s, they're strongly felt in Egypt. And we'll talk about them more when we talk about Egypt and the Egyptian Brotherhood, about the origins of this thinking. But the main point that I want to emphasize here is that their program does not share the same bases as these other parties, but sometimes they had intersections with them when it came to certain anti-imperialist questions. Not always, because sometimes, again, the Brotherhood in multiple parts of the Middle East does ally with the US and against communist opponents, for example, but it depends on the period and it depends on the moment. But as far as the Muslim Brothers see themselves and view themselves, they actually would consider themselves to be an anti-colonial force, even if they strike deals with colonial governments sometimes.
It's interesting. One thing that jumps out to me here is that in some ways, the Muslim Brotherhood's assessment of why the Arab world has fallen under colonial rule is a religious version of the Ba'athist diagnosis, or the Ba'athists have a secularized version of the Brotherhood's diagnosis, in the sense that the Ba'athists argue that the Arabs have been conquered by Europe because of problems internal to the Arab world, and thus that a renewal of Arab society and the Arab kind of being on an almost metaphysical level is required to throw off colonial rule. And the Muslim Brotherhood's diagnosis seems somewhat similar to that.
Well, all the major active political parties in this period would have a similar analysis that emphasizes the role of Arab agency, and that's because what's the point of a party then if you don't think that something locally could have been done to prevent this from happening, or something locally could be done to reverse it? So they definitely have that shared basis. You're right on that, 100%. But the variation between them is more substantial than just this is the more religious version. Because in the Ba'athist version, the Ba'ath very clearly says and calls itself in its constitution and in its main Ba'ath party covenant that it is a revolutionary party. They use the word as a hizb inqilabi, which nowadays most people reading it in Arabic would think that means that it's committed to coups, because now we use the word coup for inqilab. In the old days, inqilab used to mean revolution. So, this is very technical, by the way, conversation. I sometimes have to talk to my graduate students about it, because sometimes they read it, they're like, oh, coup, committed party. I'm like, no, wait a second. Take a step back. There's a shift in language that happens actually after the Hosni Zaim coup that changes how we talk about coups and revolutions. But that's a different story. Anyways, they identify as a revolutionary party. The Brotherhood has a different model. Their model is social reform. So it's a different theory of organization and a different theory of operating. And they have different bases for social support. Because, first of all, they have an advantage of the fact that the mosque will always exist as a space, even under the most dictatorial governments. whether it's Assad regime, Saddam Hussein regime, whatever regime you have in this world, there's the question of attacking mosques or destroying them, until we get now to the Israeli destruction of all the mosques in Gaza, which is over 200 have been destroyed. People generally tend to avoid that. Even the colonialists, they did destroy mosques, for example, the French when they were bombing Damascus, but they're more careful around that, because it is part of people's religious everyday life, and it will cause opposition if you assault their religious life that way. So they have an obvious space for social organizing in the form of the mosque, but they were also building their own mosques and institutions around them. That affords them depth. There's a social depth to the way the Brotherhood is traditionally organized. But it also means that they're not always interested in immediate change, and have historically actually been careful around questions of seizing power. That was something that is very noticeable in Muslim Brotherhood contests. They did try in a few occasions. Every time they were frustrated for a variety of reasons. But it's not a party that sees itself as primarily geared towards short-term gains. And that caused them splits within their own movement. Hizb al-Tahrir, that we spoke about before, Taqi al-Din Nabhani, he was telling them, well, you're not doing action now enough. We need action immediately. Aside from the fact that he had a slightly different theory, meaning like we want the caliphate now, restored caliphate now, But part of what he was saying is, you guys are too slow. You agree that there needs to be a caliphate. Why aren't you working towards it now? Why don't we seize power now and try to do that? They consider this to be a form of adventurism. They see this as a marathon. It's about changing society, spreading what they call da'wah in society. And, there are parallels with other religious movements across the world in that regard. And sometimes you can find even parallels with religious movements in the United States, although the main difference is, when we're talking about the Arab region, I'm slightly more sympathetic to the brothers and to those movements, because at least this is in a colonial context. And again, maybe I sometimes differ with other progressive historians in this. Some of them will just say, well, the Brotherhood is reactionary, period. I always contextualize it. I say it depends. When it comes to the colonial question, sometimes they resist colonialism, sometimes they're quietist about it. We have to contextualize it depending on the period and the setting.
That was the 5th episode of Thawra, the Dig series on 20th century Arab politics with Abdel Razzaq Takriti, who teaches history at Rice University. A scholar of Arab and Palestinian revolutionary movements, he's the author of Monsoon Revolution, Republicans, Sultans, and Empires in Oman, and the co-author of the Palestinian Revolution Digital Humanities website, an incredible resource that will be back online soon. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that revolutions are the locomotives of history, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinator is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at thedigradio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it is on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, also rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. What really does that, though, is you telling other people to check out the pod. People you know online or IRL. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.